That evening, I was alone with the emperor and the empress. She kept crying all the time, and the emperor kissed her repeatedly in order to console her. He had us go into his study. While we were there warming ourselves by the fire, he sorted out his papers, burning a large number of letters. Every time he came near the chimney, he embraced his wife, saying, "Do not be gloomy. Trust me. Do you think I have forgotten my profession entirely?" And he added while he held his wife tightly in his arms, "I will beat Papa Francis again. Don't cry. I will be home soon." The hostile armies advanced slowly and cautiously. A conference held at Châtillon gave us some hope of a general peace treaty being signed. I was under the impression, as a result of the calculations the emperor had made in our presence, that the entire force with which he was about to confront the united armies of all Europe did not amount to more than 50 or 60,000 men. I trembled when I thought of this small number of troops, but his genius sufficed to even the balance. Never did he display greater skill and greater energy. He seemed to be everywhere at once. No sooner had he defeated the enemy at one point than he would be heard of 75 miles away, again repulsing their advance, and his army, like its chief, seemed to possess the gift of multiplying itself indefinitely. It was as though the defenders of the soil of France drew new strength from the ground over which they fought. Thus it came about that at the end of a handful of heroes, the emperor was able to hold in check the hosts of the coalition. And, but for treachery, he would perhaps have defeated them. The king of Naples dared to forget all he owed the emperor and was sufficiently mad to think he could survive the fall of his natural protector. His wife shared his mistaken opinion. Ambition makes men blind, and a just appreciation of one's own abilities is the best guide at all times, one which prevents a person from making mistakes. My brother, whom the emperor had sent from Dresden to reorganize an army in Italy, defended himself vigorously. The allied monarchs offered him the same terms as were offered Murat. They promised that he should be allowed to keep the Italian crown if he would abandon the cause of France. There could be no doubt what his answer would be. He refused and informed the emperor of what had occurred. The emperor, in return, ordered him to send his wife, who was about to have another child, and his children to France. This suspicious attitude, which was, to be sure, readily understandable from a man who had just been betrayed by a member of his own family, Caroline, nevertheless annoyed my brother. Even the slightest hint of a lack of confidence offends a man who is both loyal and sensitive. Eugene's wife refused flatly to obey the imperial orders and hastened to shut herself up in the fortress of Mantua, where she prepared to have her confinement surrounded by the horrors of war, but at least not far from her husband. Eugene won several battles, and had it not been for the Neapolitan army, he would have succeeded in creating a diversion of the main attacks that were being prepared against us, and thus, perhaps, have greatly aided the emperor's efforts. The French nation was in a state of great perplexity. The number of her enemies increased each day. The two sections of the legislative body, which till then had adopted a silent and obedient attitude, began to complain vehemently. They even wished to oppose the decisions of an executive who, in the course of time, had assumed absolute power. To bring up such discussions at a time like this was to inform the enemy of our internal dissensions and place in his hands the means for accomplishing our defeat. Before leaving Paris, the emperor dissolved the chamber and the Senate as they appeared to be about to interfere with his plans for national defense. People talked of despotism. The magic name of liberty was invoked by his adversaries. From then on, everyone who opposed the emperor adopted the title of liberal. Even his generals and his marshals, tired out and discouraged, added their complaints to those of the general public. It was as though they felt their republicanism, which had so long lain dormant beneath the laurels they had won, suddenly revive. They declared themselves hostile to the emperor's ambitious plans, forgetting that they had previously been his most devoted collaborators and the first to benefit by his ambitions. The emperor shared their desire for peace, but he wished it established on honorable terms. In order to obtain them, new victories were necessary. Every man has the weakness which corresponds to his natural gifts. While the emperor was full of energy, bold in his plans, and possessed a tenacity of purpose, which frequently enabled him to conquer all obstacles and carry off the palm of victory, he nevertheless did not know sufficiently how to adapt his character to changing conditions. That very inflexibility of will, which had so long been one of his qualities, now became a source of danger to him. Yet it has been said he managed to conquer his aversion to peace until he saw that it would be based on trickery and deceit. Had peace been definitely signed at Châtillon, we should have seen the emperor as popular as ever when he returned to Paris. So eagerly did the Parisians desire his presence. But he had always been inclined to rely too much on his own military genius and the valor of the French nation. The astounding success at Montmirail had caused his hopes to revive, and he doubtless thought he could eventually obtain still better terms for France, since he always placed his country's interests before his personal ones. A short time before, wishing to unite all his forces, he had instructed the Minister of War to write to my brother to abandon Italy in order to concentrate his troops in France. Impatient of all delays, he sent my mother a letter asking her to mention the urgency of his request to her son. France first, he wrote my mother. She needs to gather all her children about her. As soon as my brother heard what the emperor wished, he sent his aide-de-camp Tascher to report the situation in which he found himself. He had just gained a victory over the Austrians and scored several successes against the Neapolitans, which enabled him to hold the foe in check there, while conserving the line at Mantua. If he abandoned his position, he was in danger of seeing his forces diminish as he advanced towards France, and he was convinced that he would only succeed in bringing a handful of troops across the frontier, while at the same time the enemy would penetrate France from the direction of Italy. Monsieur Tascher met the emperor on the battlefield of Montmirail and stated his case. "Return immediately," replied the emperor. "Tell Eugene what you have seen here, and tell him to hold tight to Italy." This victory was the last the emperor won. He persisted, however, in his efforts to keep France from succumbing to its enemies. Only the army shared this heroic obstinacy. His soldiers did not attempt to understand what was going on. They remained faithful to their cause, to the oaths they had sworn, as though they had only one idea, one hope in life, that of defending and saving their country. But fortune was against us. Paris had been hastily fortified. All these warlike preparations had terrified the townspeople, but could not destroy the natural gaiety of the French. Other nations are serious and solemn. Misfortune does not come to them as a sudden shock. They foresee that it may occur, and their foresight gives them the courage to resist it. The Frenchman finds his strength in his native gaiety. At a time when his capital was threatened, when everyone's fortune was in danger, he still managed to jest. People packed up and concealed their precious belongings as merrily as though they were going on a picnic. The theaters remained open till the very last minute. The morale of the National Guard was excellent. All the Parisians had enlisted as danger drew near and were filled with the desire to defend their homes. Only a leader was lacking. The emperor could not manage to be everywhere at once. He was outflanking the enemy in such a way as to drive the latter towards Paris. He had inquired whether the city could hold out a couple of days. Although the answer had been in the negative, he nevertheless continued to carry out his strategic plans. But while he did so, the state, deprived of only one man who could have guided its course, drifted along, the prey to any sudden accident. The habit of too strict obedience to a superior deprives the subordinate of self-confidence and initiative. He hesitates to adopt any line of action. And action, even though it leads nowhere, is better than remaining motionless. It shows at least an instinct for self-preservation. The emperor's brothers met privately. The empress was about to assume the position of regent, and I, as always, found myself in the position of being an alien to the rest of the family. My drawing room had become a workroom, and we spent our time making lint for the hospitals. These melancholy occupations had something consoling about them. Those we loved were not struggling among icy wastes. At present, they lay near at hand, almost in sight. In fact, and a sister, a wife, a mother could hasten to the bedside of someone who had been wounded. This feeling that we were sharing their danger, that we were no longer entirely alone, inspired us with the energy circumstances required and overcame that impression of being a useless burden, which generally weakens a woman's courage. On March 28th, 1814, my head chambermaid entered my room early in the morning. Greatly excited, she announced that the enemy was not far from Paris and that wounded French soldiers were arriving at the city gates. Although not fully informed as to what was taking place, I found it hard to believe that the Allies were so close at hand when none of my relatives had said a word to me about it. I had spent the preceding evening with the Empress, who had not appeared to know more than I did myself. I had played a game of whist with Monsieur de Talleyrand and Monsieur de Molay. We had joked about the rumors that the enemy was on the point of capturing Paris without having taken these tales at all seriously. For the last month, I had been going riding every day for my health. I went out as usual, and passing along the outer boulevards, I quickly became aware what my chambermaid had said was true. Many wounded soldiers who were being sent to Versailles instead of to their usual quarters assured me the enemy was not far away. This picture of war close to me, right under my eyes, made a deep impression on me. I returned home deeply moved and conscious that the moment when everyone would need all his courage was at hand. In the evening, I went quite early to see the Empress. She was about to go to the cabinet meeting where, so I was told, the question of her departure was to be discussed. I tried by 1,000 arguments to persuade her not to think of leaving Paris. I told her that if she left, she would be quite as certain to fall into the enemy's hands as if he captured the city, whereas her presence in the capital would encourage its defenders, that we must all try to be worthy of the rank we held and fulfill all our obligations to the public, that even if we were to suffer, we must accept that suffering, but that above all, she had certain duties to perform, that only in Paris would she be safe from any danger to her person, while her presence would stimulate and arouse everyone's courage and loyalty. I was still talking to her when King Joseph entered the room. I kept on arguing, but although he listened, he did not say a word, probably because in the days of the Empire, people considered all women's ideas regarding political matters as silly and worthless. I remained alone in the drawing room, waiting to find out what the cabinet meeting had decided. It was necessary for me to know at once in order to be able to send word to my mother, who, alone in her retreat at Malmaison, had no idea of what was taking place, and whom everyone seemed to have forgotten. The Duchess de Montebello came to keep me company. I knew the influence she possessed with the Empress, and I explained more in detail that I had been able to do before how essential it was that the Empress remain in Paris. I added that the Emperor was doubtless aware of our position and that he was too skillful a strategist not to know how to come to our rescue. I also pointed out that the idea of a capitulation of Paris was due to a panic-stricken state of mind, since on the contrary, everything should be done to save the city if we were not to run the risk of utter disaster. The Empress, who on her return from the cabinet meeting was accompanied by King Joseph and the High Chancellor, said to me half jestingly, half timidly, "I am leaving, and I advise you to do the same. The Minister of War assures me that it is impossible to defend Paris." I was dumbfounded. All I could answer was, "At least, my sister, remember you are losing your crown. I am glad to see that you are prepared to sacrifice it," with a smile. She came close to me and said in a low voice, "Perhaps you are right, but that is the decision that has been made. And if the Emperor finds fault with anybody, it is not I who deserve the blame." It was agreed that she was to leave that very night. The High Chancellor protested against such haste. He declared no arrangements had been made, no orders had been given, and that the Empress scarcely had time to pack up a few pieces of wearing apparel. As far as he was concerned, it was quite impossible to be ready in time. The time of the departure was put off till the following morning. Even the state funds came near being overlooked, but it was decided to send them off with the Empress's party in order to avoid having to form two escorts. I approached King Joseph and inquired if anything had been said about what was to become of us. He replied that in such delicate circumstances, it behooved everyone to decide for himself what had best be done, and that he had no advice to give me. I went home sick at heart at the spectacle of such a lack of courage. On the sight of Monsieur de Lavalette, I complained. Only women know how to rise to the occasion. And when the fate of nations depends on men, such as I have just seen, one cannot be surprised if everything goes wrong, and if the most worthy causes are lost. Then, adding to the actual seriousness of the situation a little spitefulness provoked by the ridiculous scene I had just witnessed, I described the High Chancellor's alarm, his absolute lack of energy at the moment when it was most necessary, and the unfortunate results of a policy which resulted in the Empress and her son driving away in broad daylight, without troops, without anyone capable of giving an order, and without any sort of guide, an action which resulted in their being captured 2 days later. Since I was left free to do as I pleased, I was strongly tempted to take a chance and stay on in Paris. I went to bed, putting off till the morrow the task of taking such an important decision. From the Tuileries, I had dispatched a mounted messenger to Malmaison to inform the Empress of what had taken place and urge her to leave immediately for the Chateau of Navarre. I had just fallen asleep when a message arrived from my husband, telling me the decision the Empress had taken. I replied that I already knew of it and tried again to go to sleep. A moment later, he wrote another message suggesting that I accompany the Empress. I again replied that there was time enough to make up my mind early the next morning. I thought at least I was going to get a little rest. When for the third time he sent word ordering me to leave Paris. Such a restless night, in addition to my delicate health, was not calculated to prepare me for the difficulties and dangers that lay ahead. Nevertheless, I got up and prepared to obey his wishes. This was the more easily done, as it had been for a long time a habit of mine to be ready for whatever might happen. I needed only a very few minutes to make my final preparations. The Empress had already left. I quickly felt the effect this departure had produced. The National Guard, who previously had been prepared to defend themselves, were now completely discouraged. The crowd of townspeople, who in the morning had been demanding weapons to share in the defense, appeared gravely perturbed. They had hooted the carriage of Madame Mère when she drove off, and having witnessed all those departures in broad daylight, had become indignant at this family that seemed to be abandoning them in the hour of adversity. One curious incident had occurred. The little king of Rome, who went out for a walk every morning that particular day, acting from some whim which one cannot really be called a premonition, had refused obstinately to leave his apartment. He caught hold of all doors, crying out as he did so, "I don't want to leave my house." Force had to be used to finally drag him out, and he sobbed violently. I have since heard that Monsieur de Talleyrand, as he led the Duchess de Montebello to the Empress's carriage, had helped her step in, pressed her hand, and said, "Ah, my poor Duchess, how they are fooling you." I was most uncertain what to do. There was no one near who could advise me or even organize my escape if I decided to make one. The officers attached to my household were not soldiers, and I was liable to be confronted with all the problems of a retreat. Monsieur de la Boissière was announced. He had been wounded at Bautzen at the head of a regiment which he commanded, and since then had been in Paris convalescing. I had not seen him since his marriage. Hearing of our sudden departures and remembering that he formerly served as my brother's aide-de-camp, he called to place himself at my disposal. His advice would have been useful to me, but I declined his offer, although expressing my appreciation of it, for his devotion touched me, particularly as his family were so hostile to the empire. And as he had lately married a wife whose personal sympathies allied her very closely with the former dynasty, a peasant brought the Duchess de Bassano a line from her husband, who was with the emperor, saying, "We shall soon be with you." She and several other ladies attached to the court came to see me. All were greatly pained by the empress's departure, which paralyzed all defensive measures. They shared my opinion that if Paris had resisted 24 hours, the emperor would have arrived and saved his capital. But in spite of our conviction, what could helpless and inexperienced women hope to accomplish? Meanwhile, the National Guard sent to inquire whether it was true that I too was leaving. Comte de Regnault de Saint-Jean-Gentilly, who commanded a portion of these troops, was a delegate who called on me. I answered that if they were prepared to defend me, I would stay with my children. As a matter of fact, my horses were returned to the stable, and I was prepared to run all the risks that Paris might be exposed to.